Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for March 14th, 2025. It's Friday, so I'm going to take your questions, and I have three questions from viewers that I think get right to the heart of the strategic situation that we're in. So let me just go right into them. The first one was, why won't Putin agree to a ceasefire? This is a reference to the discussion that took place in Saudi Arabia between U.S. and Ukrainian officials, where the Ukrainian officials said, yes, okay, we'll accept the ceasefire. And then the media started immediately with the refrain, now the ball's in Russia's court. Will Putin accept it or not? In an attempt to drive a wedge between the Russians and the United States. Now, Putin's response was quite clear. He said, we want to end the war. Yes, we would agree to that. But there are certain conditions that must be met to make sure that it's sustainable and not part of a plan to build up Ukraine for future attacks on Russia. And these include the neutrality of Ukraine, no more weapons going in, no to future NATO membership, and an acceptance of the territorial changes that have occurred as a result of the last 3 years of fighting. And actually to go back to the whole question of what happened with the coup in February 2014. Now, the question that comes up is not whether Putin can be trusted, but could Russia trust the West? Given the fact that since 1991, there have been repeated lies to the Russian leadership over NATO expansion, over Minsk, and over relations between Ukraine and Russia and so on. Now, you have to keep in mind also that the only reason the Ukrainians went to this meeting and made any kind of an agreement at all was because of the enormous pressure put on them by President Trump. And even with that pressure, the day before the meeting, the Ukrainians sent hundreds of drones in a deadly attack on the city of Moscow. So, the idea that suddenly you can accept the ceasefire when they know that they did this, and this is part of the continuing concern that the Russians have, then it's clear that what Putin is saying is we have to have some agreement that will allow for a sustainable peace. And the Russians have said that that's what had actually been negotiated in April 2022, that was sabotaged at that time by NATO. So that's the backdrop. And I think if you want to get a better picture of this, watch the long interview that Judge Napolitano and a couple of others, including Larry Johnson, did with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, where Lavrov gave a very clear and detailed explanation of Russia's view of the strategic crisis, also his optimism for the potential for normalization of relations between the U.S. and Russia. But that's the concern. If you want a stable, long-lasting peace, that's where you have to look, toward the normalization and a process where both sides can engage in discussions with trust. And that's why it's so important that there be a Trump-Putin call and probably a summit between the two of them as soon as possible. So I think instead of jumping in with the media attempt to portray Putin as resisting the ceasefire, you have to have this whole strategic picture in mind, and you'll realize that there's an attempt by the British and their allies to disrupt the potential for U.S.-Russian normalization. Now, the second question comes from a Canadian friend who writes the following. We're screwed. We're caught between Trump and Mark Carney. We don't want to be the 51st state, but the move from Trudeau to Carney is a step downward into a territory of great danger for Canada. And he said, what do you make of this situation? Well, here's one of the ironies. Carney is playing the sovereignty card. Here's what he said yesterday. He said, Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. If they succeed, they will destroy our way of life. Now, this is ironic that Carney is now speaking on behalf of sovereignty when in fact his whole role at the World Economic Forum, at the United Nations, at the central banks where he served, his whole role has been as an advocate of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which is an attack on national sovereignty. The idea that sovereign nations have no right to control their own resources and their own finances, that should be in the hands of technocrats who work on behalf of the global banks. And especially that way they can take control over the flow of private funds and then the mix of that with government funds to determine policies of nations over and above elected officials. So now all of a sudden he's for sovereignty? Very interesting, huh? Now, meanwhile, there's a whole discussion taking place. Oh, and let me just add that he was in charge of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which would use credit as a lever to force nations to accept the so-called green transition, which, as we can see, is destroying nations in Europe very quickly. Now, let me just add that there's a whole line of reasoning being presented from Europe, and I use the word reasoning in parentheses, that it's now possibly time for Canada to become part of the European Union, and that Canada is siding with Europe, and therefore it's a natural fit. Melanie Joly, the foreign minister, issued a call yesterday saying that if Trump can do this to us, then nobody is safe. And there was an incredibly inane email sent by Annalena Baerbock, the outgoing foreign minister of Germany, who totally discredited because of the failure of the green transition in Germany, but a picture of her with Kaja Kallas, the bellicose foreign minister of the European Union, saying to Joly, "We have your back." So this is part of a British move, and I would say that Carney coming in, he's going to be sworn in today. This will consolidate the City of London's hold over Canada. So if you're worried, Prime Minister Carney if you're worried about the U.S. seizing your resources, you're already pledging them to the corporate cartels and to the European Union. The question that you have to answer is, what will you do for the development of Canada? And I think in this case, we see his desire is not for Canada, but for this globalized world order. Now, the final question is from a viewer who asks, why does LaRouche insist that the City of London still exerts control over the Western Empire? I'd just say, look at the role of Starmer, a mediocre politician, joining with Macron to keep the war going in Ukraine. And this is an example of how London plays both sides. Last week, Starmer and Macron were the two who embraced Zelensky after the showdown with Trump in the Oval Office. And what was their position then? Keep the war going. We have to spend huge amounts of euros or dollars or whatever it takes to keep the war going to weaken Russia. They were not pacifists. They were advocates of endless warfare. Now, all of a sudden, after the meeting in Saudi Arabia, they're jumping in and they're now the pacifists. We want a ceasefire and Putin doesn't. So you have to ask yourself then, what is the goal of the city? And it's not to go with one policy or another policy. They often have plan A and plan B. Depending on how much opposition there is to plan A, they go to plan B. Their goal is control over the financial aspects of world strategic policy. That is, to side on behalf of the global banks and financial institutions to control flows of credit and trade for the sake of the City of London financial interests, the offshore banking interests, and so on. They'll embrace whatever it takes to keep that control, a gold-backed system, a Bitcoin system, flows of fiat money, whatever it takes, they'll be there as long as it maintains their central role and control. And most importantly now is the role that they would play in directing controls or directing the flows of private money into various kinds of scams. And that's why we have to take a look at the so-called discussion of central bank digital currencies, because this has nothing to do with the improving the trade and relations between nations, but everything to do with keeping it under the control of a handful of the largest banks and financial institutions. The reason they oppose Trump is he's willing to break this up, that he's not committed to the special relationship with London, and they see the maintaining of the special relationship as important to continue the unipolar order. They see Trump as a threat to that, and the danger that you might end up with a multipolar order outside of the control of the City of London. So the issue, to repeat, is the difference between a world of sovereign nations that can act for mutual benefit versus a world of top-down control by private banks operating through central banks, and from that, their control of national governments. Now, you see this dual view of the British from the column today of the editor of The Economist. She writes, "For America's allies, there is no point whining. They need to toughen up and get to work," which means to break up the potential for a move outside of the Anglo-American financial system. That's what the British intend, and that's what they're going to continue to do, no matter what they say on issues of war and peace, tight money, loose money. The real issue for them is their ability to control it. Now, for those who are still unsure about this, let me refer you to Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles of a new security and development architecture. I've linked them again. This is the discussion point that should be going on throughout the world to come up with a principled basis for international relations and trade and finance, as opposed to one that's centered on which side do you choose. Now, finally, I would urge you to join us today for the International Peace Coalition weekly Zoom call. It will be at 11 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States. There'll be a link to it in the description section. And this is where people get together from around the world to discuss the kinds of questions that you sent to me. How do we achieve a world of peaceful cooperation at a time when the direction of the world is toward war and chaos? So thanks for joining me this week. Be sure to follow up with the links I've sent, and I'll see you again on Monday.